can see there is salt on my bed. Can you see the salt? I spilt coffee on my bed. Okay. The doctor, who had been listening, had an idea that it was the right moment to interject "Se non è vero," but he was not quite certain of the words, and was afraid of being caught out. After dinner, Forcheville went up to the doctor. "She can't have been all that bad looking. She can't have been at all bad looking, Madame Verdurin. Anyhow, she's a woman you can really talk to. That's all I want. Of course, she's getting a bit broad in the beam, but Madame de Crécy, there's a little woman who knows what's what, all right. Upon my word and soul, you can see at a glance she's got the American eye that girl has." "We're speaking of Madame de Crécy," he explained, and Monsieur Verdurin joined them, his pipe in his mouth. "I should say that as a specimen of the female form. I'd rather have it in my bed than a clap of thunder." The words came tumbling from Cottard, who had for some time been waiting in vain until Forcheville should pause for breath, so that he might get in this hoary old joke, a chance for which might not, he feared, come again if the conversation should take a different turn, and he produced it now with that excessive spontaneity and confidence which may often be noticed, attempting to cover up the coldness and the slight flutter of emotion inseparable from a prepared recitation. Forcheville knew and saw the joke, and was thoroughly amused. As for Monsieur Verdurin, he was unsparing of his merriment, having recently discovered a way of expressing it by a symbol different from his wife's, but equally simple and obvious. Scarcely had he begun the movement of head and shoulders of a man who was shaking with laughter, than he would begin also to cough, as though, in laughing too violently, he had swallowed a mouthful of smoke from his pipe, and by keeping the pipe firmly in his mouth he could prolong indefinitely the dumb show of suffocation and hilarity. So he and Madame Verdurin, who at the other side of the room where the painter was telling her a story, was shutting her eyes preparatory to flinging her face into her hands, resembled two masks in a theatre, each representing comedy, but in a different way. Monsieur Verdurin had been wiser than he knew in not taking his pipe out of his mouth, for Cottard, having occasion to leave the room for a moment, murmured a witty euphemism which he had recently acquired, and repeated now whenever he had to go to the place in question: "I must just go and see the Duc d'Aumale for a minute," so drolly that Monsieur Verdurin's cough began all over again. "Now then, take your pipe out of your mouth. Can't you see? You'll choke if you try to bottle up your laughter like that," counselled Madame Verdurin, as she came round with a tray of liqueurs. "What a delightful man your husband is! He has the wit of a dozen," declared Forcheville to Madame Cottard. Thank you. An old soldier like me can never say no to a drink." "Monsieur de Forcheville thinks Odette charming," Monsieur Verdurin told his wife. "Why, do you know, she wants so much to meet you again some day at luncheon." "We must arrange it, but don't on any account let Swann hear about it. He spoils everything, don't you know. I don't mean to say that you're not to come to dinner too, of course. We hope to see you very often. Now that the warm weather's coming, we're going to have dinner out of doors whenever we can. That won't bore you, will it? A quiet little dinner now and then in the Bois? Splendid, that will be quite delightful. Aren't you going to do any work this evening, I say?" she screamed suddenly to the little pianist, seeing an opportunity for displaying before a newcomer of Forcheville's importance, at once her unfailing wit and her despotic power over the faithful. Monsieur de Forcheville was just going to say something dreadful about you, Madame Cottard warned her husband as he reappeared in the room. And he, still following up the idea of Forcheville's noble birth, which had obsessed him all through the dinner, began again with, I am treating a baroness just now, Baroness Putbus. Weren't there some Putbuses in the Crusades? Anyhow, they've got a lake in Pomerania that's 10 times the size of the Place de la Concorde. I am treating her for dry arthritis. She's a charming woman. Madame Verdurin knows her too, I believe. Which enabled Forcheville, a moment later, finding himself alone with Madame Cottard, to complete his favourable verdict on her husband with, he's an interesting man too. You can see that he knows some good people. God, but they get to know a lot of things, these doctors. Do you want me to play the phrase from the sonata, Monsieur Swann? Do you want me to play the phrase from the sonata for Monsieur Swann? Asked the pianist. What the devil's that? Not the sonata snake, I hope, shouted Monsieur de Forcheville, hoping to create an effect. But Dr. Cottard, who had never heard this pun, missed the point of it, and imagined that Monsieur de Forcheville had made a mistake. He dashed in boldly to correct it. No, the word isn't serpent à sonate, it's serpent à sonnette, he explained in a tone at once zealous, impatient, and triumphant. Forcheville explained the joke to him. The doctor blushed. You'll admit it's not bad, eh, doctor? Oh, I've known it for ages. Then they were silenced, heralded by the waving tremolo of the violin part, which formed a bristling bodyguard of sound 2 octaves above it. And, as in a mountainous country, against the seeming immobility of a vertically falling torrent, one may distinguish, 200 feet below, the tiny form of a woman walking in the valley. The little phrase had just appeared, distant but graceful, protected by the long, gradual unfurling of its transparent, incessant, and sonorous curtain. And Swann, in his heart of hearts, turned to it, spoke to it as a confidant in the secret of his love, as to a friend of Odette who would assure him that he need pay no attention to this Forcheville. Ah, you've come too late, Madame Verdurin greeted one of the faithful, whose invitation had been only to look in after dinner. We've been having a simply incomparable pré-show. You've never heard such eloquence, but he's gone. Isn't that so, Monsieur Swann? I believe it's the first time you've met him, she went on, to emphasize the fact that it was to her that Swann owed the introduction. Isn't that so? Wasn't he delicious, our pré-show? Swann bowed politely. No, you weren't interested? She asked dryly. Oh, but I assure you, I was quite enthralled. He is perhaps a little too peremptory, a little too jovial for my taste. I should like to see him a little less confident at times, a little more tolerant, but one feels that one feels that he knows a great deal, and on the whole, he seems a very sound fellow. The party broke up very late. Cottard's first words to his wife were, I have rarely seen Madame Verdurin in such form as she was tonight. What exactly is your Madame Verdurin? A bit of a bad hat, eh? Said Forcheville to the painter, to whom he had offered a lift. Odette watched his departure with regret. She dared not refuse to let Swann take her home, but she was moody and irritable in her carriage, and when he asked whether he might come in, replied, I suppose so, with an impatient shrug of her shoulders. When they had all gone, Madame Verdurin said to her husband, Did you notice the way Swann laughed, such an idiotic laugh, when we spoke about Madame La Trémoille? She had remarked more than once how Swann and Forcheville suppressed the particle de before the lady's name. Never doubting that it was done on purpose, to show that they were not afraid of a title, she had made up her mind to imitate their arrogance, but had not quite grasped what grammatical form it ought to take. Moreover, the natural corruptness of her speech overcoming her implacable republicanism, she still said instinctively, the de la Trémoille, or rather by an abbreviation sanctified by the usage of music hall singers and the writers of the captions beneath caricatures who allied the de la Trémoille, but she corrected herself at once to Madame la Trémoille, the Duchess, as Swann calls her, she added ironically, with a smile which proved that she was merely quoting and would not herself accept the least responsibility for a classification so puerile and absurd. I don't mind saying that I thought him extremely stupid. Monsieur Verdurin took it up. He's not insincere, he's a crafty customer, always hovering between one side and the other. He's always trying to run with the hare and hunt with the hounds. What a difference between him and Forcheville. There at least you have a man who tells you straight out what he thinks. Either you agree with him or you don't. Not like the other fellow, who's never definitely fish or fowl. Did you notice, by the way, that Odette seemed all out for Forcheville, and I don't blame her either. And then, after all, if Swann tries to come the man of fashion over us, the champion of distressed Duchess, at any rate the other man, he has got a title. He's always Comte de Forcheville. He let the word slip delicately from his mouth, as though, familiar with every page of the history of that dignity, he were making a scrupulously exact estimate of its value in relation to others of the sort. I don't mind saying, Madame Verdurin went on, that he saw fit to utter some most venomous and quite absurd insinuations against Prichot. Naturally, once he saw that Prichot was popular in this house, it was a way of hitting back at us, of spoiling our party. I know his sort, the dear, good friend of the family, who pulls you all to pieces on the stairs as he's going away. Didn't I say so? Retorted her husband. He's simply a failure, a poor little wretch who goes through life mad with jealousy of anything that's at all big. Had the truth been known, there was not one of the faithful who was not infinitely more malicious than Swann, but the others would all take the precaution of tempering their malice with obvious pleasantries, with little sparks of emotion and cordiality, while the least indication of reserve on Swann's part, undraped in any such conventional formula as, "Of course, I don't want to say anything," to which he would have scorned to descend, appeared to them a deliberate act of treachery. There are certain original and distinguished authors in whom the least freedom of speech is thought revolting because they have not begun by flattering the public taste, and serving up to it the commonplace expressions to which it is used. It was by the same process that Swann infuriated Monsieur Verdurin. In his case, as in theirs, it was the novelty of his language which led his audience to suspect the blackness of his designs. Swann was still unconscious of the disgrace that threatened him at the Verdurins, and continued to regard all their absurdities in the most rosy light, through the admiring eyes of love. As a rule, he made no appointments with Odette, except for the evenings. He was afraid of her growing tired of him if he visited her during the day as well. At the same time, he was reluctant to forfeit, even for an hour, the place that he held in her thoughts, and so was constantly looking out for an opportunity of claiming her attention in any way that would not be displeasing to her. If, in a florist's or a jeweller's window, a plant or an ornament caught his eye, he would at once think of sending them to Odette, imagining that the pleasure which the casual sight of them had given him would instinctively be felt also by her, and would increase her affection for himself, and he would order them to be taken at once to the Rue de la Pérouse, so as to accelerate the moment in which, as she received an offering from him, he might feel himself, in a sense, transported into her presence. He was particularly anxious, always, that she should receive these presents before she went out for the evening, so that her sense of gratitude towards him might give additional tenderness to her welcome when he arrived at the Verdurins. Might even, for all he knew, if the shopkeeper made haste, bring him a letter from her before dinner, or herself in person upon his doorstep. Come on a little extraordinary visit of thanks. As in an earlier phase, when he had experimented with the reflex action of anger and contempt upon her character, he sought now, by that of gratification, to elicit from her fresh particles of her intimate feelings, which she had never yet revealed. Often she was embarrassed by lack of money, and under pressure from a creditor would come to him for assistance. He enjoyed He enjoyed this, as he enjoyed everything which could impress Odette with his love for herself, or merely with his influence, with the extent of the use that she might make of him. Probably, if anyone had said to him at the beginning, "It's your position that attracts her," or at this stage, "It's your money that she's really in love with," he would not have believed the suggestion, nor would he have been greatly distressed by the thought that people supposed her to be attached to him, that people felt them to be united by any ties so binding as those of snobbishness or wealth. But even if he had accepted the possibility, it might not have caused him any suffering to discover that Odette's love for him was based on a foundation more lasting than mere affection, or any attractive qualities that she might have found in him, on a sound commercial interest, an interest which would postpone forever the fatal day on which she might be tempted to bring their relations to an end. For the moment, while he lavished presents upon her and performed all manner of services, he could rely on advantages not contained in his person or in his intellect, could forego the endless, killing effort to make himself attractive. And this delight in being a lover, in living by love alone, of the reality of which he was inclined to be doubtful, the price which, in the long run, he must pay for it, as a dilettante or a dilettante in immaterial sensations, enhanced its value in his eyes, as one sees people who are doubtful whether the sight of the sea and the sounds of its waves are really enjoyable, become convinced that they are, as also of the rare quality and absolute detachment of their own taste, when they have agreed to pay several pounds a day for a room in a hotel, from which that sight and that sound may be enjoyed. One day, when reflections of this order had brought him once again to the memory of the time when someone had spoken to him of Odette as a kept woman, and when, once again, he had amused himself with contrasting that strange personification, the kept woman, an iridescent mixture of unknown and demoniacal qualities, embroidered, as in some fantasy of Gustave Moreau, with poison-dripping flowers, interwoven with precious jewels. With that Odette upon whose face he had watched the passage of the same expressions of pity for a sufferer, resentment of an act of injustice, gratitude for an act of kindness, which he had seen in earlier days on his own mother's face, and on the faces of friends, That Odette, whose conversation had so frequently turned on the things that he himself knew better than anyone. His collections, his room, his old servant, his banker, who kept all his title deeds and bonds. The thought of the banker reminded him that he must call on him shortly to draw some money. And indeed, if, during the current month, he were to come less liberally to the aid of Odette in her financial difficulties than in the month before, when he had given her 5,000 francs, if he refrained from offering her a diamond necklace for which she longed, he would be allowing her admiration for his generosity to decline. That gratitude which had made him so happy, and would even be running the risk of her imagining that his love for her, as she saw its visible manifestations grow fewer, had itself diminished. And then, suddenly, he asked himself whether that was not precisely what was implied by keeping a woman, as if, in fact, that idea of keeping could be derived from elements not at all mysterious nor perverse, but belonging to the intimate routine of his daily life, such as that 1,000-franc note, a familiar and domestic object, torn in places and mended with gummed paper, which his valet, after paying the household accounts and the rent, had locked up in a drawer in the old writing desk, whence he had extracted it to send it, with 4 others, to Odette, and whether it was not possible to apply to Odette, since he had known her, for he had never imagined for a moment that she could ever have taken a penny from anyone else before, that title, which he had believed so wholly inapplicable to her, of kept woman. He could not explore the idea further, for a sudden access of that mental lethargy which was with him congenital, intermittent and providential happened at that moment to extinguish every particle of light in his brain, as instantaneously as, at a later period, when electric lighting had been everywhere installed, it became possible, merely by fingering a switch, to cut off all the supply of light from a house. His mind fumbled for a moment in the darkness. He took off his spectacles, wiped the glasses, passed his hands over his eyes, but saw no light until he found himself face to face with a wholly different idea, the realization that he must endeavour, in the coming month, to send Odette 6,000 or 7,000 franc notes, instead of 5, simply as a surprise for her, and to give her pleasure. In the evening, when he did not stay at home until it was time to meet Odette at the Verdurin, or the Verdurins, at one of the open-air restaurants which they liked to frequent in the Bois, and especially at Saint-Cloud, he would go to dine in one of those fashionable houses in which, at one time, he had been a constant guest. He did not wish to lose touch with people who, for all that he knew, might be of use some day to Odette, and thanks to whom he was often in the meantime able to procure for her some privilege or pleasure. Besides, he had been used for so long to the refinement and comfort of good society that, side by side with his contempt, there had grown up also a desperate need for it, with the result that, when he had reached the point after which the humblest lodgings appeared to him as precisely on a par with the most princely mansion, his senses were so thoroughly accustomed to the latter that he could not enter the former without a feeling of acute discomfort. He had the same regard, to a degree of identity which they never would have suspected, for the little families with small incomes who asked him to dances in their flats. Straight upstairs to the 5th floor, and the door on the left. As for the Princess de Parme, who gave the most splendid parties in Paris or in Paris, but he had not the feeling of being actually at the ball when he found himself herded with the fathers of families in the bedroom of the lady of the house, while the spectacle of wash-hand stands covered over with towels, and of beds converted into cloakrooms, with a mass of hats and greatcoats sprawling over their counterpanes, gave him the same stifling sensation that, nowadays, people who have been used for half a lifetime to electric light derive from a smoking lamp or a candle that needs to be snuffed. If he were dining out, he would order his carriage for 7:30. While he changed his clothes, he would be wondering all the time about Odette, and in this way was never alone, for the constant thought of Odette gave to the moments in which he was separated from her the same peculiar charm as to those in which she was at his side. He would get into his carriage and drive off, but he knew that this thought had jumped in after him and had settled down upon his knee, like a pet animal which he might take everywhere, and would keep him at the dinner table, unobserved by his fellow guests. He would stroke and fondle it, warm himself with it, and as a feeling of languor swept over him, would give way to a slight shuddering movement, which contracted his throat and nostrils. A new experience, this, as he fastened the bunch of columbines in his buttonhole. He had for some time been feeling neither well nor happy, especially since Odette had brought Forcheville to the Verdurins, and he would have liked to go away for a while to rest in the country, but he could never summon up the courage to leave Paris, even for a day, while Odette was there. The weather was warm. It was the finest part of the spring, and for all that he was driving through a city of stone to immure himself in a house without grass or garden, what was incessantly before his eyes was a park which he owned near Cambrai, which, at 4 p.m, before coming to the asparagus bed, thanks to the breeze that was wafted across the fields from Méséglise, he could enjoy the fragrant coolness of the air, as well beneath an arbour of hornbeams in the garden as by the bank of the pond, fringed with forget-me-nots and iris. And when he sat down to dinner, trained and twined by the gardener's skilful hand, there ran all about his table currant bush and rose. After dinner, if he had an early appointment in the Bois or at Saint Cloud, he would rise from table and leave the house so abruptly, especially if it threatened to rain, and so to scatter the faithful before their normal time, that on one occasion the Princesse de l'Homme, at whose house dinner had been so late that Swann had left before the coffee came in to join the Verdurins on the island in the Bois, observed, "Really, if Swann were 30 years older and had diabetes, there might be some excuse for his running away like that. He seems to look upon us all as a joke." He persuaded himself that the springtime charm, which he could not go down to Cambrai to enjoy, he would find at least on the Ile de Cygne or at Saint Cloud. But as he could only think of Odette, he would return home, not knowing if he had tasted the fragrance of the young leaves, or if the moon had been shining. He would be welcomed by the little phrase from the sonata, played in the garden on the restaurant piano. If there was none in the garden, the Verdurins would have taken immense pains to have brought to have a piano. Excuse me. If there was none in the garden, the Verdurins would have taken immense pains to have a piano brought out either from a private room or from the restaurant itself. Not because Swann was now restored to favour, far from it, but the idea of arranging an ingenious form of entertainment for someone, even for someone whom they disliked, would stimulate them, during the time spent in its preparation, to a momentary sense of cordiality and affection. Now and then he would remind himself that another fine spring evening was drawing to a close, and would force himself to notice the trees and the sky. But the state of excitement into which Odette's presence never failed to throw him added to a feverish ailment which, for some time now, had scarcely left him, robbed him of that sense of quiet and comfort which is an indispensable background to the impressions that we derive from nature. One evening, when Swann had consented to dine with the Verdurins, and had mentioned during dinner that he had to attend next day the annual banquet of an old comrades' association, Odette had at once exclaimed across the table, in front of everyone, in front of Forcheville, who was now one of the faithful, in front of the painter, in front of Cottard, "Yes, I know, you have your banquet tomorrow. I shan't see you then, till I get home. Don't be too late." And although Swann had never yet taken offence at all seriously at Odette's demonstrations of friendship for one or the other of the faithful, he felt an exquisite pleasure on hearing her thus avow, before them all, with that calm immodesty, the fact that they saw each other regularly every evening, his privileged position in her house, and her own preference for him which it implied. It was true that Swann had often reflected that Odette was in no way a remarkable woman, and in the supremacy which he wielded over a creature so distinctly inferior to himself, there was nothing that especially flattered him when he heard it proclaimed to all the faithful. But since he had observed that, to several other men than himself, Odette seemed a fascinating and desirable woman, the attraction which her body held for him had aroused a painful longing to secure the absolute mastery of even the tiniest particles of her heart. And he had begun to attach an incalculable value to those moments passed in her house in the evenings, when he held her upon his knee, made her tell him what she thought about this or that, and counted over the treasure to which, alone of all his earthly possessions, he still clung. And so, after this dinner, drawing her aside, he took care to thank her effusively, seeking to indicate to her by the extent of his gratitude the corresponding intensity of the pleasures which it was in her power to bestow on him, the supreme pleasure being to guarantee him immunity, for so long as his love should last, and he remain vulnerable from the assaults of jealousy. When he came away from his banquet the next evening, it was pouring with rain, and he had nothing but his Victoria. A friend offered to take him home in a closed carriage, and as Odette, by the fact of her having invited him to come, had given him an assurance that she was expecting no one else, he could, with a quiet mind and an untroubled heart, rather than set off thus in the rain, have gone home and to bed. But perhaps, if she saw that he seemed not to adhere to his resolution to end every evening without exception in her company, she might grow careless, and fail to keep free for him just the one evening on which he particularly desired it. It was after 11 when he reached her door, and as he made his apology for having been unable to come away earlier, she complained that it was indeed very late. The storm had made her unwell, her head ached, and she warned him that she would not let him stay longer than half an hour, that at midnight she would send him away, and a little while later she felt tired and wished to sleep. "No Cattleya then tonight?" he asked, "and I've been looking forward to such a nice little Cattleya." But she was irresponsive, saying nervously, No, dear, no Catlear tonight. Can't you see I'm not well? It might have done you good, but I won't bother you. She begged him to put out the light before he went. He drew the curtains round her bed, and left her. But when he was in his own house again, the idea suddenly struck him that, perhaps, Odette was expecting someone else that evening, that she had merely pretended to be tired, that she had asked him to put the light out only so that he should suppose that she was going to sleep, that the moment he had left the house, she had lighted it again, and had reopened her door to the stranger who was to be her guest for the night. He looked at his watch. It was about an hour and a half since he had left her. He went out, took a cab, and stopped it close to her house, in a little street running at right angles to that other street, which lay at the back of her house, and along which he used to go sometimes to tap upon her bedroom window, for her to let him in. He left his cab. The streets were all deserted and dark. He walked a few yards and came out almost opposite her window. Amid the glimmering blackness of all the row of houses, the lights in which had long since been put out, he saw one and only one from which overflowed, between the slats of its shutters, closed like a wine-press over its mysterious golden juice, the light that filled the room within, a light which on so many evenings, as soon as he saw it, far off, and as he turned into the street, had rejoiced his heart with its message, "She is there, expecting you," and now tortured him with, "She is there with the man she was expecting. He must know who." He tiptoed along by the wall until he reached the window, but between the slanting bars of the shutters he could see nothing. He could hear, only in the silence of the night, the murmur of conversation. What agony he suffered as he watched that light, in whose golden atmosphere were moving, behind the closed sash, the unseen and detested pair. As he listened to that murmur which revealed the presence of the man who had crept in after his own departure, the perfidy of Odette, and the pleasures which she was at that moment tasting with the stranger. And yet he was not sorry that he had come. The torment which had forced him to leave his own house, had lost its sharpness when it lost its uncertainty. Now that Odette's other life, of which he had had, at that first moment, a sudden helpless suspicion, was definitely there, almost within his grasp, before his eyes, in the full glare of the lamplight which, when he would, he might force his way to surprise and seize it. Or rather he would tap upon the shutters, as he had often done when he had come there very late, and by that signal Odette would at least learn that he knew, that he had seen the light and had heard the voices, while he himself, who a moment ago had been picturing her as laughing with him, as sharing with that other the knowledge of how effectively he had been tricked, now it was he that saw them, confident and persistent in their error, tricked and trapped by none other than himself, whom they believed to be a mile away, but who was there in person, there with a plan, there with the knowledge that he was going in another minute to tap upon the shutter. And perhaps what he felt, almost an agreeable feeling, at that moment, was something more than relief at the solution of a doubt, at the soothing of a pain, was an intellectual pleasure. If, since he had fallen in love, things had recovered a little of the delicate attraction that they had for him a long time ago, that they had had for him long ago, though only when a light was shed upon them by a thought, a memory of Odette. Now it was another of the faculties, prominent in the studious days of his youth, that Odette had quickened with new life. The passion for truth, but for a truth which was interposed between himself and his mistress, receiving its light from her alone, a private and personal truth, the sole object of which, an infinitely precious object, and one almost impersonal in its absolute beauty, was Odette. Odette, in her activities, her environment, her projects, and her past. At every other period in his life, the little everyday words and actions of another person had always seemed wholly valueless to Swann. If gossip about such things were repeated to him, he would dismiss it as insignificant, and while he listened, it was only the lowest, the most commonplace part of his mind that was inspired. But in this strange phase of love, the personality of another person becomes so enlarged, so deepened, that the curiosity which he could which he now feel aroused in him, But in this strange phase of love, the personality of another person becomes so enlarged, so deepened, that the curiosity which he could now feel aroused in himself, to know the least details of a woman's daily occupation, was the same thirst for knowledge with which he had once studied history. And all manner of actions from which until now he would have recoiled in shame, such as spying, tonight, outside a window, tomorrow, for all he knew, putting adroitly provocative questions to casual witnesses, bribing servants, listening at doors, seemed to him now to be precisely on a level with the deciphering of manuscripts, the weighing of evidence, the interpretation of old monuments. That was to say, so many different methods of scientific investigation, each one having a definite intellectual value and being legitimately employable in the search for truth. As his hand stole out towards the shutters, he felt a pang of shame at the thought that Odette would now know that he had suspected her, that he had returned, that he had posted himself outside her window. She had often told him what a horror she had of jealous men, of lovers who spied. What was he going to do? What he was going to do would be extremely awkward, and she would detest him forever, whereas now, for the moment, for so long as he refrained from knocking, perhaps even in the act of infidelity, she loved him still. How often is not the prospect of future happiness thus sacrificed to one's impatient insistence upon an immediate gratification? But his desire to know the truth was stronger, and seemed to him nobler than his desire for her. He knew that the true story of certain events, which he would have given his life to be able to reconstruct accurately and in full, was to be read within that window, streaked with bars of light, as within the illuminated golden boards of one of those precious manuscripts, by whose wealth of artistic treasures the scholar who consults them cannot remain unmoved. He yearned for the satisfaction of knowing the truth which so impassioned him in that brief, fleeting, precious transcript, on that translucent page, so warm, so beautiful, and besides, the advantage which he felt, which he so desperately wanted to feel, that he had over them, lay perhaps not so much in knowing as in being able to show them that he knew. He drew himself upon tiptoe. He knocked. They had not heard. He knocked again, louder. Their conversation ceased. A man's voice. He strained his ears to distinguish whose, among such of Odette's friends as he knew, the voice could be, asked, "Who's that?" Happy birthday, Diana Kolenchikova. You are 30 today.